ever stop him. By 1988, more than 40 women had vanished in what had come to be known as the Green River Killings. And the killer, Gary Ridgway, was still on the loose. At this point, Ridgway wasn't just evading the police. He was hiding his murderous ways so well that yet another woman agreed to become his wife. Ridgway married wife number 3, Judith Lynch, in 1988.
When they first moved here, they were newlyweds. Their eyes sparkled, they were always smiling, and they were always happy, and you just never seen them apart, ever.
But love and marriage did not end Ridgway's insatiable desire to kill. He continued to murder while managing to keep his new wife completely unaware.
He could be Gary Ridgway, the husband, and drive off in the truck and become Gary Ridgway, the killer, and come back home and be the husband again, and never give her any reason to think he was anything but that.
He had his killing career that he did out of sight from any other people, and he had the rest of his life where he was a father and he was a husband and he was an employee.
There was an inkling at the Kenworth truck plant, where Ridgway had worked for years, that he was hiding something. After all, his co-workers knew that police had questioned him in the mid-1980s.
We had the unique experience of having to work next to him, always thinking, could he be or couldn't he be? And everybody had their own opinions. Some people thought he was, some people thought he wasn't.
You wouldn't want to have a beer with him, you wouldn't want him to come over to your house. He just was a different type of a person.
Some employees at Kenworth even gave him a nickname, Green River Gary. Little did they know what he was doing to them. Ridgway later told investigators that once in a while he would use jewelry that he'd stolen from his victims to play a joke on his co-workers.
He put the jewelry in places where people could find them where he worked. When one of the employees picked it up, put it on, and had a real good find. In Gary's mind, I think he walked very quietly and had a little smirk on his face, and there was a big smile inside of him, reminding him of the young ladies he killed.
And that isn't all he apparently did with his victim's possession.
He had huge garage sales, and he'd have just gobs of stuff.
I guess the kind of funny thing I always saw was a lot of jewelry, a lot of young girls' jewelry, and a lot of mixed pairs of shoes.
Gary Ridgway was sure that he had his neighbors, his co-workers, the cops, and everyone else completely fooled.
But I think after a while, he was winning the game. And he says, hey, I'm doing pretty good.
So well, in fact, that the police investigation was forced to slow down. Though Ridgway was still killing, far fewer bodies were being found. As the case dragged on with no resolution, the investigation task force steadily got smaller and smaller.
By 1990, there were 5 of us left. I left in April of 90. There's 4 left. By 1992, Tom Jensen's the only guy left.
I tried to keep it alive as best I could in the mind of the public.
It began to seem hopeless until modern technology gave investigators some help they desperately needed. Back in the 80s, detectives had painstakingly taken samples from crime scenes. They didn't even know what good it might do, but they cataloged it and stored it anyway.
They refrigerated it and preserved it because, you know, sometimes as people can say, well, this is not doing anything good. It's just taking up room in our evidence room. Let's get rid of it. That didn't happen.
Their foresight didn't begin to pay off until the summer of 2001, when DNA technology was finally good enough to analyze that evidence from the 80s. 19 years after a woman named Marcia Chapman was strangled and left to rot on the banks of the Green River, samples taken when her body was discovered went to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab.
There was spermatozoa there, and we were able to generate a male DNA typing profile that matched Gary Ridgway. It's really amazing, the profiles we got.
Then they tested samples from victim Carol Christensen. Again, a match with Ridgway. For all those years, Gary Ridgway had gotten away with murder. Finally, the cops had the proof they needed to nail him.
We had tears in our eyes. It was a great moment. One I won't forget.
And there was even more good news on the way. New techniques could now identify microscopic particles of paint collected years earlier at the crime scenes. And scientists were able to link them directly to Ridgway.
We find out there's spray paint, which was chemically identical, at least, to the material that Gary Ridgway was working with at the plant where he worked. He was bringing paint particles, unbeknownst to him, into his vehicle, into his home, and if victims were in his vehicle and his home, those would be transferred as well.
And this is where Ridgway wasn't thinking very clearly, as paint samples matched exactly.
With evidence in hand, the task force would soon put an end to Gary Ridgway's reign of terror. For nearly 20 years, Gary Ridgway found perverse pleasure in murdering dozens of women and getting away with it. He became America's most prolific serial killer. The insignificant boy who was a failure in school found satisfaction in outsmarting an army of investigators.
We didn't hold him when we had him in '87. We didn't hold him when he was contacted in '84 and '83. So he had to have felt that he was winning.
But on November 30th, 2001, the game ended for Gary Ridgway. DNA evidence tied him to 4 Green River victims, and he was arrested at his home.
One of my neighbors came rapping on the door and he said, "Hey, Clem, did you see who they arrested?" And they had a picture of Gary back on the TV. And I said, "You gotta be kidding. Ridgway, the Green River Killer."
When I heard and saw the picture of Gary on the news, my heart stopped and my stomach went into the biggest knot. I was so shocked.
Despite the clear physical evidence linking him to these crimes, Ridgway protested his innocence. His family stood by him and refused to believe the worst.
They stuck with him. They visited him weekly, his brothers, their wives, his son, and they were quite concerned and quite convinced that this was all wrong, that Gary couldn't have done this.
Ridgway's wife, Judith, also remained loyal as long as she could.